Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. If you're tired of censorship, outraged by government abuses, and thirsty for real insights, then you're in the right place. Get ready, because here, the fight for freedom never ends. Here's your host, Professor Nick Giordano.
What's up, everyone, and welcome to the America's Founding Series, part of the P.A.S. Report podcast. Is your host, Nick Giordano. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss an episode, and share this episode with others so they can hear stories of the great patriots who shaped this nation, their forgotten patriots. And I want everyone to picture a young nation fighting for its life. You know, this is 1777, winter setting in. You already know that the Continental Army is not doing well. You look at a Continental soldier, they're shivering in the cold, feet wrapped up in rags because we couldn't afford boots and we didn't make boots. His musket is rusted, ammunition pouch is empty. He's starving, freezing, and the American Continental Army is certainly outgunned. Why? It wasn't just because the British were a superior fighting force. It was because America had almost no factories. We had no foundries to cast cannons, no mills to weave uniforms. For a century, we relied on Britain for every finished good that we used, and that dependency left us extremely vulnerable. It left the revolution hanging by a thread. But in every great American crisis, someone steps forward. That's the beauty of America. That's the uniqueness of our country. It's what makes America such an exceptional nation. Now, imagine one man, largely forgotten today. We have failed education systems, so you're not going to know his name, and he isn't on the battlefield holding a musket. He is a merchant. He is someone from Philadelphia, and he realizes something that most of the founders missed in the heat of the moment. You can't declare independence if you're dependent on your enemy for the shirt on your back. If you're dependent on the enemy for the powder in your guns, that's going to be used against them. And it was in this moment that a little-known patriot named Tench Coxe understood that winning a war for independence meant building a nation that was capable of standing on its own. And today, we're telling his story. Because you might not know his name, but you live in a world he built. He was the hidden architect of America's economic strength. He was the man who understood that true liberty requires two things: economic power to produce for yourself and the physical power to defend yourself. So who was Tench Coxe? Why does his story matter, and why does it matter now? To understand him, you have to understand that he wasn't born a revolutionary like Samuel Adams. In fact, he was the opposite. Coxe was born in 1755 into Philadelphia elite. He was merchant royalty. He grew up surrounded by fine imported china, British textiles, the comfort of the status quo. Him and his family invited to the parties, rubbing shoulders with top-level officials. And when the rumblings of the revolution started in 1776, Coxe didn't grab a flag. He hesitated. He was 21 years old, young guy. His family had deep ties to British trade. To be honest, that was his livelihood. And early on, he leaned Loyalist. He looked at the chaos of rebellion and he backed away from it. He even resigned from a local militia company. He was someone who grew up in a very privileged household, and the revolution threatened that privilege, the comfortable lifestyle that he was so used to and accustomed to. But history has a way of finding you, whether you wanted to or not. And in late 1777, the British Army occupied Philadelphia. The Redcoats marched in, and for a young merchant like Coxe, this should have been a relief. These were the protectors of order. And he joined a Loyalist militia corps affiliated with the British forces that were under the command of General Howe. But the reality of occupation was actually brutal. He saw the arrogance of the British officers. He saw the suppression of his neighbors. And then the tide turned because the British had to evacuate Philadelphia. The Patriots returned and they were angry. So Coxe was accused of being a British sympathizer. He was arrested and he faced the very real possibility of losing everything: his property, his freedom, maybe even his life. However, he was able to walk away from it. And it was in that moment of crisis, that a major shift began to happen. Coxe wasn't radicalized by a pamphlet. He was radicalized by the reality of the time. He realized that loyalty to a distant crown was a suicide pact. He took the oath of allegiance to the state of Pennsylvania, not some far-off government and far-off king. But this wasn't just a conversion of convenience to save himself. It was a conversion of pragmatism as well. See, this is the first lesson Coxe teaches us. It's one that we need to hear. Patriotism isn't always in a lightning bolt, right? It's not something that strikes us in the heat of a moment. Sometimes there's a slow realization. That's what makes human beings so remarkable. The metamorphosis we undergo, where the side we once sympathized with no longer reflects who we are. And the moment comes when you're faced with a choice. You either stand back in silence, or you cross the line. You fight for something bigger than your own comfort or privileges. That's how unexpected heroes are born. Now, Coxe realized that a nation's survival depends on more than just high-minded ideals being put forth by people like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and John Adams. It requires a real-world capability. And when he looked around at the devastation the war had caused, specifically the economic devastation, he decided he wasn't just going to be a citizen. He was going to solve the problem that was nearly killing the revolution and almost ended the patriot cause. He didn't pick up a rifle, he picked up a pen. And a pen can be just as powerful during these times. So during the war and the fragile years that are going to follow it, Coxe noticed a fatal flaw within the American experiment. Trying to secure independence without economic independence, even if we could muster victory, how could and would America survive economically when we're dependent on foreign nations for everything? We couldn't make our own gunpowder. We couldn't make our own muskets. We barely had a textile industry. So Coxe began writing. He used his merchant background to hammer home a simple truth. A nation that can't supply itself cannot defend itself. Ultimately, we're going to go on to win the revolution, but America is going to remain extraordinarily vulnerable. We're going to remain really weak. The Articles of Confederation is going to collapse, and it's going to create chaos. Tench decided that he was going to be part of the Continental Congress in 1788, but his battlefield's going to be on the printed page. So he started writing essays under pseudonyms, urging Americans, stop buying British finery. We got to start building American factories. We got to start making American goods for the American people. And he became a one-man supply chain advocate. He understood that when the supply lines from Europe are cut, America is going to be at risk. It continues to weaken us. And he saw the stakes. He understood that the British didn't want us to succeed. So to him, a factory wasn't just a business, it was a fortress. Industry wasn't just a tool, it's a weapon of independence. And he saw firsthand that America could not remain free if it's going to continue to rely on other nations for critical goods. Now, does that sound familiar to you today? I mean, think about this logically. Our medical supplies, our microchips, our rare earth minerals, where do they all come from? Think about how dependent we are on other nations. Think about how weak and vulnerable that makes us. And that's where we have so many frauds in office, because they recognize this. You have both Democratic and Republican members of the House and Senate that understand this concept. They understand this dependency, and we saw it during COVID, did we not? But yet, what have they done to try and fix that dependency? See, people like Coxe weren't just fighting for economic independence. They were fighting for a nation. They understood the importance of a nation. And Coxe was a remarkable man because he saw the beauty of America. He saw the promise that it offered. And he is someone that is also going to fight against one of the greatest evils of the time. We're talking slavery. Long before abolitionism became a national movement, Coxe used his pen to argue that slavery was incompatible with the principles of the Revolution. In 1787, the same year that the United States Constitution would be drafted, he published essays called Slavery an Odious Practice. He pushed for policies that would restrict and ultimately end the institution, the practice of slavery. He supported the idea of gradual emancipation throughout Pennsylvania. He praised free market labor practices over slave labor. He argued that a republic that preaches liberty cannot survive if it's going to deny it to others. He believed that slavery wasn't just immoral, it was economically destructive. He insisted that a nation built on free enterprise, innovation, industry could not prosper while relying on forced labor. In his mind, slavery is going to undermine America's ability to develop the manufacturing power it's going to need to propel us to true independence. Freedom and productivity go hand in hand, and he saw that. By fighting both economic dependency and slavery, Coxe made the same argument on two fronts. A nation can't be free if people are enslaved, and a people cannot be secure if their economy is dependent on others. His vision of America required a free citizenry, free morally, free economically, and free politically. Tench Coxe was the first one to ring the alarm bell. Economic independence is a national security issue, and slavery is both a moral and economic issue. Now, we need to take a quick commercial break, but when we come back, we're going to talk about how Coxe teamed up with Alexander Hamilton to create the American economic machine that would propel us to become the superpower we are today. And the quote he gave destroys every modern argument against the Second Amendment. So everyone hang tight, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to the America's Founding series. Now, if you're enjoying the story of Tench Coxe, a remarkable patriot that you probably never even heard of before, do me a favor. Give this forgotten patriot his due. Share this episode with 3 or 4 other people. His story is exactly what we need in this moment, because we've seemed to have forgotten who we are as a people and as a nation. So I want to get back to Tench, because the American Revolution ends. America is free on paper, but we are broke, we are disorganized, and we still aren't making anything. Now enter Alexander Hamilton, the first Treasury Secretary. Everyone knows Hamilton. We've all heard him before. He's on the $10 bill, helped to frame this nation, but standing right behind him in the shadows was the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Tench Coxe. He's often called the father of the American cotton industry, but he was much more than that. He was the intellectual ammunition behind Hamilton's famous report on manufacturers. Hamilton always gets the glory. It's always amazing how that works. But historians believe Coxe wrote the original drafts and supplied the raw data that Hamilton needed. So here was the radical idea Coxe pushed, that we have to industrialize. At the time, Thomas Jefferson and others wanted America to be a nation of simple farmers. They thought factories were dirty, they were corrupt, industry would corrupt the politics and the government. Coxe argued the opposite. He said that if we didn't build factories, we would essentially become a farm for Europe, selling them cheap raw materials and then having to buy back expensive finished goods from them. He argued that we needed a balanced economy, and agriculture and manufacturing work hand in hand. So he wrote the prompt establishment of manufacturers in the interests of all the states. And he wasn't talking about globalism. He didn't believe in globalism. He was talking about national self-sufficiency. He believed that the only way to have true freedom was to embrace capitalism and production here at home. See, Coxe understood liberty requires muscle, and that muscle had to be homegrown. It wasn't talking theory. He had lived through chaos of war, where soldiers froze because America couldn't make shoes, where we couldn't afford to buy shoes. But Coxe knew that economic strength wasn't enough, that you also need the physical means to protect those industries. You need the physical means to protect that liberty that we have. And this brings us to one of the most important and overlooked contributions that Tench Coxe made to our history, and that's his defense of the right to keep and bear arms. Now, in the early days of the Republic, there was a massive debate. Should we have a standing army? See, the founders, they were terrified of standing armies. They saw them as corrupt, they saw it as abusive, and they understood that that's how governments are easily overthrown. They had seen how kings used armies to crush ordinary people, so they were very suspicious. So the Constitution proposes a different path, and that's this idea of a militia. There will be an army and a navy in order to combat foreign threats. But today, you hear people constantly twist the Second Amendment. They say, oh, the militia just means the National Guard. It means a government army controlled by the states. That's not what Tench Coxe was talking about, and he destroyed that argument 230 years ago. He was writing in the Pennsylvania Gazette to explain the Constitution to the people, and he wrote one of the most powerful definitions of the Second Amendment ever to be put on paper, and nobody talks about it anymore. And I want you to listen to these words closely. This is Tench Coxe speaking to us from the founding era. Quote, "Who are the militia? Are they not ourselves? It is feared then that we shall turn our arms each man against his own bosom. Congress have no power to disarm the militia, their swords, and every other terrible implement of the soldier. are the birthright of an American. Now let that sink in. Who are the militia? Are they not ourselves? Coxe was crystal clear. The militia is the people. It is you. It is me. He believed that the ultimate check on tyranny wasn't a piece of paper. It was an armed citizenry. And he reasoned that the powers of the sword belong to the people. Why? Why did he argue that? Because a free people defend themselves while a dependent people wait for permission. Self-reliance wasn't just economic for Coxe. It was moral. It was civic. See, he understood that you cannot claim to be a free citizen if you rely entirely on the government for your safety, just like you can't be a free nation if you're relying on your enemies to provide your steel. You might think a man this brilliant would actually be celebrated, but he's not. Why? Part of it has to do with Coxe himself. He had a very difficult personality. He wasn't that well liked. He was an outsider. And he eventually had a massive falling out with Alexander Hamilton because Coxe believed that Hamilton is taking it too far. Coxe was a man of principle. He wasn't a man of political party. And he believed that the Federalist Party became too elitist, that it was too cozy with British banks. Coxe remembered the war. He remembered the scarcity. He didn't want America to drift back into British dependency. So at the time, he did the unthinkable and he switched sides. He joined Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. He didn't do it for power. He actually lost status by doing that. He did it because he saw the Jeffersonians at that moment in that particular time as the better vehicle for American independence. And he would criticize both sides when they drifted. He was infuriating to the politicians of his day because he refused to play the game of politics that we see being played each and every day today. He challenges the idea that patriotism means blind loyalty to a particular leader or a particular party. Patriotism meant loyalty to a principle, an independent, self-sufficient republic. That's where his loyalty lied. And he reminds us today that the government is not America and America is not the government. Now, Coxe is going to die in 1824. Didn't have a monument. Didn't have a musical written about him like Hamilton. He was largely forgotten, overshadowed by the giants. But look around you. Every time you see factories in America, that's Tench Coxe. Every time you exercise your right to protect your family and your property with your firearm, that's Tench Coxe. Every time we debate the dangers of relying on foreign supply chains, we're having an argument that Tench Coxe had in 1787, the one that he started. His fingerprints are all around us. And Coxe warned us. He warned that a nation dependent on foreign powers, especially when it comes to rivals, eventually loses its sovereignty. He warned that a people dependent on the government for protection will ultimately lose their autonomy. His world was shaped by scarcity, so he responded with industry and responsibility. Those are the same pillars that we need today. He understood a fundamental truth, that freedom collapses when a nation can't produce for itself, and when its people stop taking responsibility for their own lives. Liberty survives only when both the country and the citizen remain self-reliant. It's why I do the new contract with America, why I'll be releasing Part 3 on Monday, because the story of Tench Coxe, the pen behind America's prosperity and the remarkable man he was, he talked about the importance of self-reliance and economic independence. His legacy deserves to be recognized, and that's why you should share this episode with 3 or 4 patriots you know. Also, don't forget, leave a good review for the P.A.S. Report podcast. Do it on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. So now I want to thank you for joining me today, and I'll be back next week with other great episodes of the P.A.S. Report podcast.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report. Don't forget to rate, share, and hit that subscribe button. That way you'll never miss an episode. For more exclusive content and updates, visit us at pasreport.com and follow Professor Giordano on all social media platforms at P.A.S. Report.